Welcome to another video in our series about the basic biology of aging according to the four-process model. I am Dr. James Wordsworth, shown here in a full Jedi robes. So the question of how do we stop aging is the topic of this talk. And what does it actually mean to stop aging? Well, Tithonus is a Greek myth about a Trojan prince who falls in love with Eos, the goddess of the dawn. And they ask Zeus if, because he's mortal, Zeus will bestow upon him immortality so that he can stay with Eos forever. And Zeus, being the kind of guy that he is, grants this wish with one small caveat, that instead of remaining healthy forever like the actual gods, Tithonus will grow older and older and weaker, but never die. So of course, what does it mean when we stop aging? It absolutely does not mean this. This is actually, as far as anybody could see, impossible to do. It would be much harder than curing aging and maintaining health. Because aging is not simply the passage of time. Aging is specific processes, or a process, and according to the four-process model, it is four very specific processes, three of which we discussed in our introduction talk, What is Aging?, which if you haven't seen is possibly worth watching before you watch this talk. However, if you would like to just continue, the idea is that as a result of DNA damage, we get cells that get slower and faster, and this results in two of the three aging processes, intrinsic aging and celeresis. Celeresis results from cells that get faster, and by faster I mean they have a faster metabolic rate, whilst intrinsic aging results from mutations that cause cells to get slower. We did discuss this in more detail in What is Aging? I will also discuss brief parts of it again. And intrinsic aging results in a third process called extrinsic aging, which results in multiple problems and diseases. So as we talked about before, when specific kinds of DNA damage occur in a cell that make that cell metabolize, grow and replicate faster than the surrounding cells, that cell gains an advantage compared to the cells in the surrounding tissue, which allow it to outcompete them. And this is the natural course of tissue-level selection, by which I mean, if we do nothing to stop it, this is what should happen in all of our tissues. However, it isn't. But it is happening in some tissues when things go wrong. And that's because when you have tissues that get highly damaged and you get lots and lots of cell death, what you require in order to not die of having no tissue or organ left is compensatory cell proliferation, which gives a serious advantage to these faster cells, shown here in blue with the little fast rabbit hairs, as in the tortoise and the hare, which allows them to outcompete these wild-type cells and overtake the tissue. And that leads to diseases like fibrosis, which is the overproduction of collagen, and cancer, which is the overproduction of cells. And we talk more about this, or these two diseases, in another talk that should already be available, How Aging Causes Disease. So this, process one, we called celeresis, meaning cells that get faster. However, the reason this doesn't happen in all of our tissues is because we have evolved a defense mechanism. And this defense mechanism is a mechanism of cell communication that we described in a paper we published in 2022, where cell communication causes slower cells to slow faster cells, leading to a gradual metabolic slowdown. And it does this epigenetically, so it induces permanent marks on top of the DNA which cause the cells to become slower. So this second process of metabolic slowdown we called intrinsic aging. So the idea is that intrinsic aging has evolved to prevent celeresis, which is essentially the running away of these faster cells, which would occur normally if we didn't prevent it. However, it has additional consequences in that as our cells slow, they do less metabolism per minute or per unit time, including translation, transcription, DNA replication, and cell proliferation, meaning they use less ATP. And when they use less ATP, of course, this puts our ATP out of equilibrium. So in order to restore equilibrium, we produce less ATP. which means our ATP levels will go back down to what we want them to be, but at the same time we are burning less fuel, less lipid and less sugar, which we normally use to convert ADP into ATP for our anabolic or metabolic activities. And what that means is, as we use less fuel and fuel builds up in our cells, they automatically will reduce the receptors which cause them to intake fuel, and that fuel then remains in the blood. And the major receptor that we use to intake fuel is the insulin receptor, which means over time our bodies become insulin resistant, and of course this extra fuel that we're no longer intaking into our cells is deposited in our adipose or fat tissue, which means we gain weight with age. Importantly, our adipose tissues also have homeostatic mechanisms to prevent them from accumulating too much stored fuel or stored lipid, which are they secrete inflammatory cytokines, which attract macrophages, which kill the cells and eat the lipid and send it back to the liver to get rid of. But what this means is that as we need to get more and more fat cells because we have more and more stored fuel, we get chronic inflammation around our fat tissue. Now, our main adipose storage tissue is our subcutaneous adipose, and this is designed for long-term lipid storage. So this is the first one we fill up by virtue of a sensitivity differential with our short-term visceral adipose store, which essentially under normal conditions would accept less fat because it has less receptors. However, as metabolic slowdown means that we are storing more and more lipid in our subcutaneous adipose tissue, the sensitivity differential disappears, which means we start to store more lipid in our visceral adipose, which means we get visceral weight gain with age, leading to metabolic syndrome and even type 2 diabetes. And this process 3 we've called extrinsic aging, which is essentially defined as how our slower cells progress towards metabolic syndrome due to fuel overload. So 3 of our 4 processes then are intrinsic aging, celeresis, and extrinsic aging, which results in weight gain, insulin resistance, and chronic inflammation. And these lead to our age-related diseases, as we described in the How Aging Causes Disease talk. So to slow aging, we have to target the problems caused by these 3 aging processes. And of course, the first one being celeresis, which leads to things like cancer and fibrosis, can be slowed by intrinsic aging. And intrinsic aging causes diseases like sarcopenia, and as well as contributing to cardiovascular disease and neurodegeneration or Alzheimer's. But it also causes extrinsic aging, which also contributes to these diseases. So if we were to target intrinsic aging, what would result? Well, we might get rid of some of these diseases, but at the same time we're encouraging celeresis, so we might even increase the diseases associated with this first aging process. So let us instead start with extrinsic aging, which is much more simple and could at least help with a lot of age-related diseases. However, it is called extrinsic aging for a reason. It is largely a disease of these excess fuels, leading to insulin resistance, weight gain, and chronic inflammation, and that means it's easily targetable by reducing these fuels, which can be done with various behaviors such as exercise and calorie restriction. However, a lot of the time people don't do these things because, to be frank, a lot of the time it seems better just to die. However, what this means is that these conditions progress to metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes, which a lot of evidence suggests can be prevented by these regimens of exercise and dietary restriction. One of these conditions that is not so much associated with metabolic syndrome is chronic inflammation. And that is largely because chronic inflammation, whilst would probably be a good marker of metabolic syndrome, is also a marker of things like infection, cell senescence, DNA damage, and even just aging. So the reason we don't use chronic inflammation to describe metabolic syndrome is likely because it isn't specific enough as a marker rather than it is unrelated to metabolic syndrome. However, according to the 4-process model, inflammation is mainly protective. It allows us to attract macrophages and remove our lipid-laden cells, meaning it is required for our adipose homeostasis. Now, some of you are probably thinking, what the hell is this guy talking about? Chronic inflammation is protective. That's not what I've heard. Everybody knows inflammation causes disease. It's associated with all of these diseases that I have already talked about. However, I would like to point out that it is associated with all of these diseases. There is not necessarily evidence that it is causal. Alzheimer's, they've done a lot of trials with anti-inflammatories, and most of the evidence suggests that they do no good. Some of the evidence even suggests that it's harmful. John Breitner, who was one of the lead researchers in the trials of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, ended up saying that there was a lot of hope based on epidemiological data that these drugs would prove beneficial, but we have learned over the last 10 to 15 years that when you test NSAIDs in trials, they are not beneficial and invariably you make people sick. This is doubly true for cardiovascular disease, where anti-inflammatories make you considerably or significantly more likely to die of disease. Additionally, as we've already said, inflammation protects you from weight gain. It allows you to remove the lipid-laden cells by attracting macrophages, which remove them, and then you can replace these lipid-laden cells with insulin-sensitive cells that are not lipid-laden by proliferation. So, hurrah! Inflammation is protective. And they've even shown this in studies where they feed mice high-fat diets or high-calorie diets, and inflammation helps these mice stay thin. When you remove inflammation, the mice get considerably fatter. So is inflammation perhaps just associated with these diseases the same way that paramedics are associated with injured or dying people? Have we mistaken the medics for the disease? Are we arresting the paramedic at the crime scene purely because they're always there? Well, my answer to that is probably no. Everybody knows inflammation causes disease because it does cause disease. However, it might be more limited than we currently believe. There is good evidence that inflammation is involved in rheumatoid arthritis and fibrosis, as we've discussed in How Aging Causes Disease. And anti-inflammatory drugs are used repeatedly in the treatment of these diseases. They are not so much used in cancer, even though we suggest it is important, because the reason inflammation causes cancer is that when you have lots of inflammation, you have to have tolerance, or else you end up with autoimmune diseases, which means chronic inflammation causes cancer, but it also means you cannot treat cancer by removing inflammation. You have instead to remove the cause of inflammation, which again is covered in another talk. So to slow aging then, we can target extrinsic aging, and that can be done by exercise or calorie restriction, and that should contribute to reduced diseases of sclerosis and extrinsic aging. And the reason it does this is because it reduces the fuels which cause cardiovascular disease and neurodegeneration, whilst at the same time it removes the necessity to increase inflammation, which leads to cancer and fibrosis. However, the problem with targeting extrinsic aging is that you're targeting the process almost right at the end. You're targeting from fuel overload onwards, and you're leaving all of the underlying processes untouched. So in our previous talk, we covered that intrinsic aging is this process that happens over time, increasing our mortality or our risk of death due to the increase in these epigenetically slowed cells. And as these cells get slower and slower, at the same time, what they're doing is causing increased fuel overload. And what that means is that we can, at any given age, decrease or increase our mortality by targeting this extrinsic aging. And that can have significant effects on our mortality. So if we exercise or undergo calorie restriction, for example, and we reduce the fuel overload, what that means is that at any given age, we will have reduced risk of death. But at the same time, if we stop our exercise or calorie restriction regimen, our mortality should go right back up to what it was before. Our cells would have slowed just as much as they would have done anyway, and now all of the excess fuels are back. So our mortality remains what it would have been even if we'd never done the regimen. So in order to have more prolonged effects, we need to target intrinsic aging. And we do this by targeting the process of cell communication, which leads to this epigenetic slowdown. Now, of course, the underlying process which requires we have this communication between our fast and slow cells is DNA damage. So, of course, we could try to stop DNA damage. And that means that We don't get cells that get faster and we don't get cells that get slower. They're all the same, and we don't need this cell communication. We don't need these epigenetic marks, and we don't have this induced metabolic slowdown. So why doesn't this work? Well, it doesn't work. And if you're interested in why, you can go to our fourth process of the 4-process model talk. However, for that reason, I'm not going to cover it in detail here. The point is that it doesn't work, which means in order to target intrinsic aging, we need to target this communication mechanism. Now, we published details about this communication mechanism back in 2022, and when we did that, we thought long and hard about the most ridiculous name that we could give the process, and we came up with Operation Epic Fury. Joke, obviously we called it selective destruction, which at the time I thought sounded really cool and might be something that would catch on, but now with the benefit of time sounds more like something from a child's comic. But we named it that because this communication process is selective. When cells spot that the neighboring cells have different metabolic rates, a slow cell is much more likely to slow a faster cell, even though either of them could be the mutant, then a faster cell is to accelerate a slower cell. It's selective. So why does selective destruction occur then? It is a mutant correction system. If we just had wild-type cells that had the same metabolic rate, we wouldn't need it. But because cells are getting faster, we need to make sure to keep metabolic rate constant and prevent celeresis. So the question is, what aspects of cells and tissues can we target to slow or prevent this selective destruction from occurring? Obviously, the effect size of the mutation is important. Whilst a minor mutation in metabolic rate might be ignored, the slower cell might be insufficiently confident that something's actually gone wrong, whereas a much bigger mutation will be, first of all, much more likely to be identified, and second of all, appear much more threatening to tissue homeostasis. So mutations with a bigger effect are much more likely to result in selective destruction and epigenetic slowdown. However, of course, this is much more relevant to celeresis. So what we're interested in for intrinsic aging is why our slower cells are slowing our wild-type cells. Here we are much more interested in effects that we can do to the wild-type cell that will prevent it from being slowed by slow mutants. And one factor here is the growth signal. And IGF-1 is one of the big growth signals in our bodies. So when there is not much IGF-1 about, and we have cells with different sensitivities to this growth signal, it means that whilst they might appear a bit faster, it might not be enough to induce this process of selective destruction and metabolic slowdown. However, when the growth signal is much higher, now our wild-type cell starts to look, oh, perhaps this is a mutant cell. It's going considerably faster than the slower cell now. So the slower cell induces selective destruction, epigenetic slowdown, and converts it to a slower cell. So one way, of course, is calorie restriction. Now, when we look at the growth pathway, we have these nutrients which induce IGF-1, and that induces an intracellular molecule called mTOR, which induces our anabolic processes such as protein translation, and that's also affected by amino acids, which again are the molecules which make up proteins, and that's again affected by our nutrient levels. So when we have calorie restriction, we are reducing these nutrients. We're reducing the IGF-1 signal, we're reducing the TOR signal, and we reduce our rate of anabolism, our molecule building metabolism. But of course, we don't really like doing this because it means we're constantly hungry. What if instead we could have a pill that would directly target our mTOR system? And of course, we know there is such a pill. That pill is rapamycin. And together with calorie restriction, both these things can reduce our rate of intrinsic aging by making our wild-type cells appear slower. As you can see here with lots of growth signal when we have our fast cell, which results in metabolic slowdown. If instead we have low growth signal, we essentially put a little camouflage hat on which prevents the slower cell from recognizing and slowing our wild-type cells. But the important distinction here is that these cells have received no permanent epigenetic marks. If the growth signal was reversed, they could be right back to being much more metabolically active. However, whilst calorie restriction is reducing the nutrients, which then reduces the anabolic stimulus, rapamycin is directly targeting mTOR, which is not in any way reducing this nutrient supply, which means that this nutrient supply is quite likely to build up, meaning that rapamycin is going to cause extrinsic aging by contributing to the fuel overload. And there is actually considerable evidence that rapamycin induces metabolic syndrome and even type 2 diabetes in the short term. However, both rapamycin and calorie restriction are targeting intrinsic aging, which means they are reducing the rate that our mortality increases with age. They are slowing the rate of aging, they can extend our maximum lifespan, and they can have lasting effects even after the regimen finishes. But what about true rejuvenation? Unfortunately, they are not doing this. Arguably, they are reducing our extrinsic age, so they are targeting one aging process, but the main process of intrinsic aging remains slowed but not reversed. In order to actually rejuvenate us, we would need to remove the epigenetic marks that are aging us, converting our slow cells back to wild-type cells. And crazily, there are actually treatments that can do this. We have this cocktail of 4 proteins called the Yamanaka factors, or OSKM, where you might have heard of them. Add this to cells, it removes their epigenetic marks and completely rejuvenates the cell. However, unfortunately, aging is not the only epigenetic process. Development is also controlled completely by epigenetics. Every cell in our body has exactly the same set of genes. What determines whether the cell is a nerve cell or a gut cell is epigenetics. So when we remove these marks that age us, we are also removing the marks that determine cell fate. So we're converting all of our cells back to stem cells, which means when you try to apply these Yamanaka factors to actual animals like worms, what you get are dissolved worms that sort of go back to little pools of stem cells. That's not to say that it's hopeless. At the moment, people are investigating whether we can use pulses of these factors to remove the aging marks without removing the development cell fate marks. And that is actually looking quite promising. Perhaps even more significantly for the 4-process model is that there might be pathways and processes we could target that would remove the age-specific marks without targeting the developmental ones. Meaning that if we applied them to animals, we could just rejuvenate without converting them into pools of stem cells. Unfortunately, the problem with such rejuvenation is that whilst a lot of our cells might be going back to wild type and rejuvenating us, when we remove these epigenetic marks that have been there to control out of control cells, some of them will revert back to their fast cell state, and we might be contributing to processes like celeresis. So in summary, maintaining health and delaying aging can be achieved by one behavior, which is calorie restriction. Health span can be lengthened by other processes such as exercise, which counteract the fuel overload associated with extrinsic aging. We also have drugs that can target mainly lifespan, such as rapamycin, which unfortunately exacerbate problems like fuel overload. And we even have treatments which show potential for true rejuvenation. There will be more videos of these things to come. However, if you'd like to go straight to another video, there is the introductory video, What is Aging? We have another one talking about how aging causes age-related diseases, according to the 4-process model. And the more astute of you will notice that I've only actually ever talked about 3 processes. The 4th process is described in another video because it's a bit more complicated. You can also go to agingrethink.com, which will show you all the resources we have available talking about aging, or you can listen to our podcast, Undoing Aging, which is shown on the website, or you can go to Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And there will be a book available at some point, which is going to go into all of this in a lot more depth. And you could go to agingrethink.com to see if at the time you're watching this it's already available. Otherwise, thank you very much. You can subscribe to the channel to see if there are any more videos you'd like to watch. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening. I hope you learned something.